as you know, GSM is a great community, very collaborative, where people work together. So it is like great to be, among all of you. Again, so we decided to organize this this town hall. We did one 3 weeks ago, actually, for our current students. We're all living like in kind of a new world, with COVID-19. We still a lot of uncertainty. Some of us, have lived through several other, downturn in the economy, but very different than this one, because this one is really affecting different level of society. It's a global, it's a global, issue. And one thing which is also like very interesting in a certain ways, when you think about, planning and the future, most of the companies have to go back to the drawing board because nobody, all the projections that were made are wrong today. So I thought it would be good today to have, Paul and to have Tracy, and have both of them, give us their, perspective on what's happening, give us some, very good advice. We had a fantastic town hall with the student, like as I said a few days ago, and maybe have their knowledge share with like all of us. And maybe before I start with the first question, I would love to ask Paul and Tracy maybe to give a very, very short introduction about, themselves. And Paul, do you want to start?
Well, I usually let ladies go first, but...
Okay. We do that in France also. So Tracy.
Please, Paul, you go ahead. It's good.
That's fine. So I'm a graduate of UC Davis, ag economics. Actually, at the time, it was ag economics with a managerial economics emphasis, rhetoric minor, all kinds of fun stuff. That was too long ago to admit. Okay, it was 1985, quite a while ago. I am not an MBA. I actually have a master's degree in management, an MA in management. I got that on a Rotary Foundation scholarship at the University of Kent in Canterbury, and had a chance to sort of explore business from a sort of different degree perspective, which was kind of fun. And then spent about 30 years in corporate human resources. So list of companies is fairly long, but includes places where I was head of HR, whatever the title might have been. It could have been VP, it could have been CHRO, at places like Next Computer, which was the company that Steve Jobs founded when he left Apple. And I had an opportunity to work with Steve for about 7 years before we sold the company back to Apple, then briefly in a number of different companies, including PeopleSoft for a number of years, running HR in a larger company, publicly traded, was in smaller companies doing things like mobile phone applications. This is before the iPhone came out. Networking, those sorts of things. Spent some time on my own in a consulting company doing organizational development consulting, doing OD work, culture work, a lot of executive development, executive coaching, team development, team coaching, those sorts of things for a number of technology companies here and in Southern California. And my last role was at a company by the name of Alumni, which is actually a partner to UC Davis and the Genomics Center there. It's certainly the leader in the market of developing DNA sequencing instruments, so capital equipment, but on a fairly significant growth spurt. When I was there, we started with about 1,500 people, and when I left 4+ years later, we were over 5,000. So it was quite a massive growth spurt and an exciting time to be there. And I ran HR there, about 120 people or so. So generally sort of mid-sized to smaller, a few larger companies, and a lot of different experiences in corporate HR. And most of my time is spent coaching and advising people on careers and on leadership inside companies. So this is a pretty easy connection for me to provide some support.
Thank you, Paula.
Sure.
Okay. Well, now that's a lot to follow up on. So I don't have nearly the as good of a background, but so I have a kind of a varied background. I originally went to art school. I spent the first part of my career in publishing. I had a couple of businesses, did a lot of work for myself, worked with different magazines, newspapers. Then I got a degree in economics. Also, obviously, as you can see, my MBA from Davis. I worked in finance for a little bit, and then I switched over to HR. So for a while, a couple of years, I was supporting the artificial intelligence product group at Intel, and most recently moved over to their programmable solutions group, which they develop FP&As, which is, well, it doesn't matter what it is. So anyway, I work with the 3 business units that are sort of the customer facing units, and I support 3 of the vice presidents within that organization. And that just kind of involves really anything the organization needs. It could be OD work, talent planning, help with recruiting, compensation and benefits, all sorts of things, and just sort of being kind of the coach and sort of trusted partner for the leaders that I support at the company, and also doing a lot of employee relations work too. So I do a lot of just, I guess we'd say, customer facing work with employees on the ground as well. So.
Well, thank you. And I just want to thank again, like Paul and Tracy, who are really great contributor to what career development is trying to do with students and the whole communities. So thank you again for being there. So I'm going to ask the first question, and I will ask Paul. I know that ladies first, but the first question I'm going actually to direct that to Paul. But Paul, during your career, you have experienced more than one significant, economic downturn. What are some of the lessons learned that you can share with our alumni community?
Yeah, I was obviously employed and working during the, I guess we're calling it the Great Recession now, of 8, 9, part of 10, I guess it was. And, inevitably, if you have a career that lasts more than 7 to 10 years, you're going to face one of these as well if you haven't already. So these are more, I would say, learned lessons for me anyway, that are less about coronavirus specifically than they are about sort of downturns in general. So I'll just share some of my experiences and maybe a little bit of learning there, and if it helps, hopefully. The first one is don't freak out. It's easy to get carried away with the negative stories, particularly in the crisis we're in. If I can continue to call it a crisis, I guess I can. Certainly an economic crisis that we're in now, that we're facing now. We've never seen anything like this. Even the Great Depression, which of course none of us lived through, in the 30s, didn't have this kind of fall off. As sudden, as steep, and as scary, frankly, as it is. And it's easy to get scared if you spend a lot of time reading the news or listening to the pundits or looking at the stock market go up and down, and looking at the unemployment numbers particularly, right? 20-something million people unemployed, but that's happened literally in the space of about 6 weeks. It's remarkable. And so it's easy to freak out, which is why I say don't freak out. And the reason I'm saying don't freak out is because the people that can work their way through this and keep a reasonably level head about themselves and come up with a plan. If for example, I guess part of this is a question of whether or not you're in a job and you're potentially looking for another job or looking to make a move, or if you're between jobs, maybe you've been affected by this downturn and you've been laid off, or perhaps you're anticipating the fact that your job might be at risk and you're anticipating that you might lose your job, or you might just decide this is the time and you want to leave your job for whatever reason. Some of this depends on where you might be in that cycle, but particularly for those of you who may not have a job right now, I would suggest to you that having a plan instead of freaking out is a choice you can make. And I would encourage you to make that choice. I think the other reason not to freak out is that because this has been so sudden and so steep, I think my sense of this, and I'm not an economist necessarily, even though I have an econ degree from Davis, my sense of this is that the rebound will be more significant and hopefully quicker than we would typically see rebounds from more endemic kinds of recessionary pressures. And I think it'll take a while for employment to come back, of course, but I think it will come back. And I think the companies that are well positioned, particularly with respect to cash, and aren't necessarily in the industries that are the most severely affected, for example, travel, are going to have the ability and already are still hiring, to be honest. They're still hiring and they will continue to hire. And if anything, the smart companies are ramping up their hiring because they know that there are a lot of really great people that are out on the market now. So obviously they may not be hiring as broadly or as aggressively as they've been, but those opportunities exist. And the don't freak out piece is, if you work a plan to find them and you really focus on networking, you're going to be in a better position than you probably expect. So have confidence that you will be able to look for a job if you don't have one. And if you have one and are considering changing, doing a job search while you've got one is a great option as well. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is, be prepared for a longer search process. The last time we went through a pretty significant downturn, I was out of work for 14 months. Now that's a long time, and I'm not going to suggest that that's exactly what you're going to experience if you're currently out of work. I don't want to add to your freak out nature, perhaps, or your anxiety. But I would say that the reason I was out of work for 14 months is I was looking for a particular role, and I was looking for a particular type of company. But it was a downturn, and so it took a lot longer. And what I needed to learn, and I have learned, is that you have to be patient, not to just necessarily plaster your resume out for everybody to see, but to be particularly specific and prepared for the kinds of opportunities that fit you and fit what you're looking for. Now, that being said, I think the third lesson is, and I'll close it here, is you've got to be flexible. I think you need to be ready for a different kind of role, potentially a different kind of company, a different kind of industry. It's possible that you may need to target different sorts of roles than you've expected, than you've played in the past, or that you might even want in the future. But understand that this is not necessarily a long-term decision. It's a 2 to 3 year decision, potentially, that would allow you to get different kinds of experience and get back on the path that you might want to. So while it will take longer to find the ideal job, and maybe longer in general, my recommendation to you is to be patient with that, but also to be flexible and take advantage of opportunities to learn and grow and develop your career and skills in ways that you might not have anticipated. So a few learnings.
Thank you, Paul. Tracy, now I have a question for you. You're a human resource professional, in a large company like Intel. Can you give your perspective on how firms adjust their human capital needs, and especially what it may mean for recruiting in general, or the opportunity, if you're working in a large company, for lateral movement within the firm?
Yeah, so I think in many ways, it's really still too early to say what firms are going to do, because there's been so much fluctuation and uncertainty. And I think a lot of companies are really still figuring that out. They're trying to figure out, how do I get to next month and get through the next couple of weeks, and they're not thinking too much further out. So everyone really is saying, what can I do today to get through tomorrow or next week? I know a lot of groups, especially at Intel, we have tons of teams across the entire company that are meeting on a weekly, daily basis, giving constant updates. We have regular meetings just sort of talking about, what do we think things look like? What does return to work look like? How do we, roll that out? So we also have some sort of unnatural changes in the market, where maybe firms would have been laying off with like the payroll protection program. A lot of companies, they're now holding on to people and avoiding the layoffs and keeping people on the books in order to stop people from filing for unemployment. So, and that's going to last just about 8 weeks, and then we'll sort of see what happens. So of course, I know we're seeing a tremendous amount of people being laid off, but I'm also still seeing hiring. So I'm still seeing attrition coming from Intel. I'm seeing people coming in and moving around. I know we've had some shifts and sort of changes at Intel, and I've been able to see, gosh, in one instance, we were able to place almost 1,000 people in new roles within the company. So there's definitely opportunities for lateral moves. And, I can't really speak to the nuances of each company and all of their pain points, because I think we're still going to really see who's going to thrive coming out of this. And obviously we're seeing some winners and losers on different sectors in the economy. So I think once the dust settles, there's going to be opportunities, as Paul said. I think it's going to be, It might take a little bit longer. I think the opportunities are going to be different. And so right now is a good time to just pay attention to what's happening in the world and be ready to make some shifts and adjustments and be agile and flexible. And I think the opportunities will open up.
Great, thank you so much, Tracy. Now I have a question actually for both of you. Some economic sectors may be impacted in the long term. Which segments do you believe will be more resilient and potentially offer more opportunities in the coming months? And what do you predict will be the biggest challenges that large and mid-sized companies will face in the months to come? And just before you answer, one of our participants just wrote in the chat, but Amazon is hiring. So for anybody who is looking to work at Amazon, please know that the company is hiring.
Go right ahead, Tracy.
Oh, okay, sure. So there's really, it sounds like kind of two questions there. The sectors I think will be more resilient, and then which I'm sort of seeing like, I'm taking that as where should people be looking for work right now? And then the biggest challenges. So for the first part of the question, I think Paul sort of touched on this. Obviously, travel industry is really taking a big hit. I think travel and entertainment are really struggling right now. I think I heard some airlines have like 3% capacity. So that's not a place to go look for work unless you're sort of looking at like entertainment as far as like online streaming and in-home entertainment. I think healthcare is pretty interesting right now. There's a lot of economic pressure because there's a lot of specialty work and selective or elective procedures that are being canceled. I know that there are some layoffs happening, but there's also a lot more demand in other areas. And I think that there's a really big appetite for digital technology in this space, and there's a lot more online appointments. So I think looking in that area, there could be some interesting opportunities that open up. I think that state and government agencies have really been really stressed, very busy at this time. There's probably a lot of work to be done. I think we're also seeing a lot of weaknesses being exposed with the state and government agencies where they aren't up to speed, they don't have up-to-date technology, they really need an overhaul of their systems. And I think really anything in technology where you don't need to be in front of people teaching online, I think a lot of things have moved online, and I think that there's space there. I think a lot of people or companies weren't really prepared with business continuity plans. So thinking outside of the box, and maybe instead of thinking of sectors that might need you, I think it might be more functional opportunities, because I think most segments aren't going to go away. Obviously, we're going to lose some of our smaller businesses in some areas, but I think thinking about what type of work you might want to do would be different. Then the second part of the questions is the challenges that companies will face. I think, even though it seems counterintuitive because we're going to have a lot of people on the market, I think staffing is going to be an issue because we're seeing a lot of layoffs, but downsizing and then restaffing up it's expensive and it takes a long time. And so just because there's a lot of talent available doesn't mean it's the talent that a company might want. And it takes time to bring people on board, to get them trained up to speed. And I think it might be hard for companies to ramp back up. So I'm not sure if that's the case. These are just my opinions. Again, you know, even though I studied economics, I'm not an economist, so it'd be hard to say for sure.
Yeah, I would add, I think Tracy, you're right on. I would add a few things to that. One is some of the reading I've been doing and some of the feedback I've gotten. When I've asked that question to people like executive recruiters, for example, recently, and I've been in touch with several, or I've got a number of people that I've reached out to in preparation for this and the other town hall who are currently, you know, running HR organizations in technology, biotech companies. The word I get from them around sectors is it's less about sectors and more about kind of roles. So, for example, anytime you're going from a period of downward growth to a period where you're looking for growth again, you're looking for sales and marketing people, you're looking for business development people, you're looking for folks who can interface with customers and identify opportunities. So sometimes strategy, business development, corporate development, those sorts of things. And again, some of those sectors are going to be important to some extent, but more so in terms of what to avoid. And I think we talked about that a little bit. I think the sectors that you should expect, I think we should expect to see some growth in would include anything with respect to e-commerce, which has just taken a huge explosion, right? As a result of this, everybody's on their computers now all day, pretty much, even more so than they used to be. Anything with respect to remote work, I should say, or e-learning is likely to continue to have a pull. I think we can all agree to some extent we're not going to go back to business as usual. Doesn't exist anymore. And so what does that mean? We're going to have to redefine that as we go forward. But it certainly suggests that at least the third or so of the country that are knowledge workers who can work at home will probably do that more regularly than before. Therefore, you'd expect that remote working technologies, networking technologies, we're going to have to improve our networks consistently, infrastructure, those sorts of things. Transportation logistics as an outcome of e-commerce, I think, is another example, if that's a space that you're interested in. Healthcare to a large extent, because we're going to see a lot more money put into those areas, and I think, with that comes hiring. I think with respect to challenges that employers have, one thing that is starting to occur to me that I don't know that a lot of employers have even started to track yet is, how do we get people to work? The concept of mass transit is it's anathema to social distancing, right? So how is that going to work if social distancing continues to be part of our lives for the next 12 to 18 months, which it likely will in some form? I don't know how to answer that issue, but to the extent you've got some pretty interesting entrepreneurial work going on around either remote working or figuring out how to carpool share with 2 or 3 people and not, be on BART, for example, in the San Francisco Bay Area, or be on AC Transit or be on Caltrain or whatever the mass transit might be. Those might be some interesting things to look at.
Thank you. So how do I, as an employee, position myself while the company is shifting or reorganizing during the pandemic? And how can I make myself more valuable to my employer, both now and post-pandemic?
Do you want me to go, Paul? Or okay. I think that right now employees really need people who can be flexible, are willing to jump in and just do what needs to be done. Quite frankly, I think you can pay attention, look for where there's gaps, fill them, and make yourself useful. Everyone also has an opportunity to highlight skills that maybe they haven't had a chance to use that they'd like to leverage. So, maybe you're a great facilitator in person and you can translate that to becoming a great online facilitator. There are different skill sets. So maybe you can think about new ways to do business, keep things afloat. I think leaders are also finding ways to let other people step up right now. So take that opportunity. We also need people that can help other people stay healthy and be resilient. So do you have ideas on how you can help your workforce be more resilient? Do you have ideas on how you can sort of motivate people and pick everyone up during this time? A lot of people are really struggling and having a hard time. So I think if you can be the person that demonstrates resiliency and helps others get through this time with a positive attitude, that's going to be something that's really helpful. And I think be the person that offers to help, not just the person that's jockeying to help themselves.
Yeah, some of this sort of is a response to the question about what side of the line might you be on. Are you currently employed? And how do I make myself more employable, stickier with my current employer, which I think is largely maybe, Tracy, what you were referring to. The other one is, if I'm not employed or I'm expecting I'm not going to be employed, how do I make myself more attractive to a potential employer? So there's slightly different answers, but I would echo Tracy's comments in the sense that this is a pretty chaotic time, and it's going to continue to be that way until we figure out whatever the new normal might look like. And it's going to take a while for that to settle in and become routine, even with the many changes that we expect or can anticipate. And so in chaos, what I was always looking for as someone who ran an organization of a few hundred people, potentially, and all the way down to just a few, but particularly larger organizations, is who is in a problem solving mode versus who in my organization is in a complaining mode. And, Tracy talked about energy. That is a huge issue. And I mean that in a positive way. It can be a huge differentiating positive issue for you. And I don't mean that you need to put on a happy face and pretend. I mean, hopefully that to the extent you've got positive energy, you're able to corral that and focus it. Everybody has ups and downs, and we have to give each other a lot more freedom to experience those at times of chaos and uncertainty that we're experiencing now. But I would say that I was always looking for people who understood and could see problems to get solved and would put positive energy into trying to solve those problems. So whether it's keeping people positive, whether it's encouraging and supporting and training other people, whether it's anticipating problems that might happen and coming to your boss or your boss's bosses in anticipation of, here's some things that we think might be coming down. Here's, if you're in the organization, one of the best opportunities you have is to collect information of people that are talking to you and filter that in a way that helps people identify what the problems are, at least in your area or in the areas of the people that you're working with, I should say. And then coalescing those into here's a potential problem, or here's an existing problem, and here's how we think we should solve it. It might be a customer problem. It might be a product issue. It might be an employee related issue. It might be organizationally related. Whatever that may be, it doesn't have to be, and probably isn't going to be in your particular area or job description, but the people that would be willing to go outside of their job descriptions while still getting their core job done were the people that I had the most time for as an executive, because I wanted to hear what they had to say. I wanted to who had views into problems and issues in their company, in the company I was working in, that I didn't have. I didn't have access to that information, and they did. And when they add their own ideas to it and solutions, then it became real valuable.
Okay, thank you. Next question, again, like for both of you. What change do you think will last in the professional landscape operations post-pandemic, and what factors do you think might constitute the new normal? And I wanted to bring like what I read the other day. One executive in the technology space was actually saying that, companies may rethink like, open space, that has been the norm in like many companies. So we'd love to have your insight and your ideas there.
Sure. So I think, obviously anyone's guess is as good as mine. But Paul touched on this a little bit. I think this could be a tipping point that moves us more in the direction of a remote working environment. So, we all know necessity is the mother of invention, right? So 6 months ago, if you had asked most companies, hey, can you do 89 to 90% of your work remotely? They would all have said, absolutely not, no way. And yet here we are 6 weeks, 8 weeks later, and everyone has 80 to 90% of their workforce offsite, or in some cases, 100% of their workforce offsite. So I think this all happened really quickly. And, in the past, we've had studies and experiments of, hey, what does it look like to work remotely? But now we have this big forced test environment where it's happening in real time, and we don't really have a choice. This is what we're doing for the most part, with, the exception of some essential workers that have to go in. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that changes the work environment. I think, being here in California and, back and forth to the Bay Area, I come down, I live in Folsom, but I come down to the Bay Area a lot for work. Maybe it would help the cost of living or the housing crisis in the Bay Area. Maybe we don't need people to live in the Bay Area to work in the Bay Area. Maybe they could be in the Midwest and still work for a tech company here. We've also seen a big shift in education. I think I heard that 9 out of 10 people are now studying online instead of in person. So maybe there's a bigger shift there that sticks around and sort of solves some problem. This is obviously a really terrible situation, but we're also seeing a lot less congestion. And so if we have a positive outcome or an unexpected benefit, it could just very well be some positive changes to the environment, possibly. And then finally, I think we're all forming a new ability to form relationships and collaborate online in a way that we didn't have to do before. And I do think it's a different skill set, and I think it's a good thing for us to learn. And I'm guessing that a lot of these new tools and new methods of collaborating are going to stick around too.
There's no way I could possibly improve on that answer.
I'm sure that's not true, Paul.
So I'll go to my last answer before we open for the Q&A. And again, for the Q&A, please type your question like on the chat box. It may be easier. But let's take like this case. You know, I haven't been in touch, so I'm a worker. And I haven't been in touch with my network classmates or former colleagues in a while. And it feels, you know, awkward reaching out now because I need to ask for help, you know, with my networking job. So what are some suggestions for reaching out to a professional network such as LinkedIn, especially if you have been like kind of remote for like a few years? How do you go back to being like in the, you know, networking with people, be back with classmates, networking, developing like a new professional network? What are some of the advice you would say?
Well, let me jump into that, and then Tracy, I'll let you hit cleanup. I think the concept of networking, when you can't see people face to face and talk to people face to face, is a little bit weird for all of us, right? We're used to, at least at some level, there's a lot of networking that goes on obviously online, but not being able to meet face to face sort of feels like, how can you really do that very well ultimately and build the relationship? But we're, you know, to Tracy's point earlier, we're going to have to learn how to do that better. And so this actually is the time to double down on networking. And if you haven't been particularly good about that, and there have been times in my career where I sort of fell off that wagon and got too focused internally on my job and stopped reaching out to people, I've had to sort of rebuild my networks periodically as well. So I have exactly that experience in the sense that it's been, you know, several years maybe since I worked with someone, and this is the kind of person that I think I'd really like to be in touch with, but I haven't talked to them in maybe 2 or 3 or maybe even longer years. And my experience with that is that most people in general are glad to hear from you if you had reasonably good working relationships, even if you had sort of just a passing working relationship, but they would know you by face or by name, and they have a positive, you had a positive experience with each other. They're going to be generally positive toward responding to you. Now, there are always people who will ignore everybody but the few people that they know the best. And sometimes you're just going to have to accept that and be patient with it and move on. But I would first of all have a positive outlook in the sense that, you know, consider yourself, if somebody, and this has probably happened to you, somebody's reached out to you that you haven't seen in a while. What's your first reaction? Hey, it's good to hear from you. Mm-hmm. It's likely that people will have that same reaction from you as well. And the other piece of advice I would offer, and then I'll hand it over to Tracy, is I think your outreach to them has to be proportional. The amount that you are open or vulnerable or talking with them in a personal way has to be proportional to how closely you know them, right? If you haven't talked to somebody for 5 years, you're not going to necessarily ask how their vacation was last month, or you know, right off the bat, or you're not going to necessarily say, hey, you know, I'm looking for a job, can you help me, as abruptly as that, or even in similar ways. You're going to start more professionally and a little more formally, perhaps, versus someone that you know pretty well. So, you know, again, use the opportunity to use LinkedIn or to email to make initial contact and say, hey, listen, you know, I thought we had a great working relationship. I wanted to reach out and reconnect. I'd really value the chance to get your advice on something I'm going through right now relative to a job search or advice. People are very willing to generally give their advice, and they're much more willing to respond to a request for advice and counsel and expertise than they are to a request for job search help. That doesn't mean that they won't also offer you job search help, but my experience has been that if I ask them for their advice about it, I'm much more likely to get a response. Tracy?
Yeah, so I do agree with that very much, Paul, for sure. I do think, to start off with, I think a good overall lesson that we can take away from now is to always sort of think about being kind and generous with your time, because that will serve you well in the long run. I just think that's a good lesson. And I also think that the truth of the matter is most of us don't reach out to our network. So we're talking about, oh, I haven't reached out to this person in a while. Well, they probably also haven't reached out to you. And I guess it might be more awkward if they have been reaching out to you and you've been ignoring them, but I'm guessing that's probably not the case. I also think we're in an extraordinary circumstance right now. And the pandemic is kind of a natural icebreaker, right? That's a good, easy way to lead in. Everyone understands the situation. I think there's a lot more reaching out because of the circumstance that we're in, and people generally want to be helpful. I think if you're still really concerned and you feel uncomfortable, one thing that you might try to do is reach out to people who are closer friends or closer in your network first. You can have a more vulnerable, honest, open conversation with them and be really upfront and say, gosh, I am in a bind right now. I'm really stuck. This is what I'm trying to do. Do you have any connections or any thoughts, or can you help me? I think what Paul said is very reasonable. Ask them for advice and suggestions. They can probably then help facilitate a warm handoff for you to help you avoid some awkwardness. So can they connect you with someone that they know? And then you're getting a warm introduction. It's not like you're cold calling or just sending someone an email. That can help. That said, I do really think that people want to help one another right now. So I think if you were to reach out, again, I agree with the asking for advice rather than help me get a job, to start off the conversation is a good idea. But I think that's a good, I think most people are not going to be surprised to hear from people given the circumstances. And then I'd say, as Paul also mentioned, we might not hear back from everyone, but also remember a lot of people are working a lot more hours. If there have been layoffs where they were working, they're homeschooling their kids in many cases. They might be taking care of their parents. They might be completely overwhelmed. So I would say if you either don't hear back, don't feel bad, or if you hear back from someone who says, I'm just so crazy, I don't have time, but you're not working at the moment, maybe see, hey, can I help you? Because that goes a long way in the sense of goodwill. So, I mean, think about this in both ways. Other people might need your help too.
One thing I'd add to that would be, as much as you can when you are networking, particularly with people whom you may not know deeply and recently, be as specific as you can about what you're looking for, or about the kind of roles or the kind of companies or sectors or industries that you have interest in learning more about. The more specific you can be, the more likely it is that people can help you. Or they can tell you, I don't think I can help you, but I know somebody who can, and they might refer you to somebody in their network who has experience or expertise in some of those fields or those kinds of roles or those kinds of companies. I think one of the worst mistakes that people make at least when they call me, is they call me and say, listen, I'm looking for a job. Do you know about any jobs that are open? I'm like, dude, what are you talking about? First of all, I don't even know what kind of job you want, let alone what's open. So let's talk a little bit more about, I try to get them to pull back, because particularly if this continues to go on, this being sort of this downturn and a lot of unemployment, you're going to see people become increasingly desperate. And if you are a person who's looking for a job, try to avoid as much as possible looking and sounding desperate. Like, I'm willing to take a pay cut for this job, right? That kind of thing. Leave that for later when you're trying to close it or something, or do it in a different way. But that smell around desperate people tends to really turn hiring managers and recruiters off, because they think you're more interested in finding any job than finding the job they want you for, or they may want you for. So back to the specificity, I would be really clear with your networking colleagues or people that you're networking with, just to say, listen, this is what I've done. I'd certainly be open to doing that in the past, but here's a couple of things that are ideas. You give them hooks to go off of, because it's amazing to me how often when you tell somebody something like that, literally 2 days later, something comes across their email or somebody gives them a call and says, hey, I'm looking for X, Y, and Z. It might be a recruiter calling them, for example. And all of a sudden they go, oh, you know what? literally 2 days ago, Paul called me and he'd be the perfect guy for you. It's sometimes the top of mind things that believe it or not, are the right place, right time examples of how people get work. And so giving people some of that specificity will allow you to stay in their head when pattern matches come up for them.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both. So now we're going to open it for question and answers. Everyone can, I have my colleague, Karina Hotaling and Maggie Gonzalez, who can, if you want to send your question anonymously, not using like the view all, you can address that to them. But we're looking forward to your question. And I think that we had one question. Let me see. I think, yes, one question was from William. How can leaders continue to lead a team which is now remote and distributed?
Yeah, it looks like Gail actually posted a really nice answer to that and the link. But I think, you know, a lot of what's there, and I think, you know, what we're seeing is, I sort of said earlier, you know, leaders really giving more opportunities to people, letting other people step up. I know what I'm seeing a lot of is leaders are just making themselves much more available for people across all levels of the organization. They're doing a lot more FaceTime video calls, reaching out. I know a lot of the GMs that I'm supporting, you know, they're doing like morning calls, you know, it's like happy hour for Penang and coffee for, you know, the UK staff or the US staff. And so we sort of switch it around different times during the day and get everyone together. So I think it's really just being available, being vulnerable, being honest, and making sure everyone's hearing from them a lot more. At least that's what I'm seeing. And that seems to be helping people a lot more in the workforce, because it sort of helps with trust and they feel like they have some accessibility to their leaders. And to me, I think that that's helpful.
Paul, you're
muted, Paul.
You're muted.
Yeah.
Sorry. There's a few things that I would typically advise my leaders to do in times of crisis. And they're consistent with what Tracy was saying. But specifically, one would be your number one, and now this is me talking to leaders, your number one job as a leader is to stay visible and to be available. And so to do that, you've got to connect, right? You got to stay connected to your teams as teams. You've got to stay connected to individuals. You don't have the luxury of walking into somebody's cubicle or somebody's office or having them do the same to you anymore, or at least won't for a while. So you've got to be willing to do a lot of ad hoc communication as opposed to only scheduled communication. And hopefully you can, you know, that fits within the world of work. Because they need that, and some need it more than others. I think, if anything, it's an over. You hear this, let's over communicate. Well, you can't over communicate in a time like this until you get somebody who's saying, "Listen, stop sending me Zoom invites. I've got to get some work done." Okay, then you're over communicating, but that doesn't happen very often. I think the other opportunity here for you is to assess where each of the people who are on your team, if you're in a leadership role, where they are emotionally, where they are sort of, if you will, spiritually, you know, how they're reacting to this, giving them room to be lighthearted at times, or to be, you know, less talkative and maybe to be irritable at times, understanding that people have a variety of ways of reacting to this, but also trying to show as much empathy as you can as a leader, not only to give them that room, but also to be connected to them individually and help them express that. And then help guide them to, you know, positive behaviors if it looks like things are going negative or not productive. So bonding with your team, bonding with individuals, and practicing inclusion of everybody, not just the folks who are your direct reports, but making sure that everybody is there and doesn't get left out in these kinds of connections, I think are probably some of the most important things you can do as a leader.
Yeah, I thought of something else. Another good thing that I'm seeing actually within my group is really good role modeling of self-care, because a lot of times people are saying, hey, you have so much on your plate, you're taking care of your family, you're doing this, and you need to take some time for yourself. But if people see the leaders working nonstop and not taking a break and not taking time for anything, then they feel like they don't have permission to do that. So I think it's good for leaders also to say like, hey, between 11 and 2 every day, I'm going to be homeschooling my kid. I'm not going to be available. I'm not going to be online. I'm logging off, so that other people have permission and feel like they can do that as well. So I think good role modeling right now is extremely important as well.
This is great. Thank you, Tracy and Paul. Any questions? Maggie, do we have any questions or?
Not at the moment.
I would also love to hear other people's opinions on some of what we talked about on the line. I mean, we've got, you know, all the alumni on the line. We've got a group of really smart people that, I don't know, I feel like probably know a lot of, you know, have different ideas, know more than me. And I would love to hear what other people sort of are experiencing and going through, and their thoughts on this as well. If anyone would like to share.
So one thing that I've noticed in watching all of this unfold, you're really getting a sense for who you want to work for and who you don't want to work for based on how they're treating their staff with the sudden flexibilities that are being forced upon all of us, and, you know, these external factors that are changing the way we're working so drastically.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a really great point.
I think that may have been Megan. Megan, are you referring to people that you want to work for or don't want to work for inside your own company, or are you looking externally and hearing about how they're treating employees through, for example, news media reports? Megan, you're muted. I don't know if you're trying to talk.
Yep, sorry about that. I lost my speakers. I lost everything there for a second.
That's okay. Did you hear my question?
I did not.
That's okay. My question was, when you're talking about the information you're getting about who you might want to work for based on how they're treating people, is that inside the company you're in, or is that about other companies based on news reports or other kind of information you're getting?
Both, definitely both. Inside, I'm hearing a lot of really interesting stories about certain companies. One in particular that comes to mind, Amazon, has been getting a lot of negative press for their treatment of warehouse staff and delivery drivers, which is very unfortunate because when it comes to some of their more professional roles, they've actually been handling this downturn very, very well. So it's an interesting dichotomy there. But what I'm hearing from folks inside at Amazon is a very different story than what the media is projecting. And they're actually doing, I think, much better than how they're being represented.
Yeah, that's exactly why I asked, because having been on the employer side of both positive and negative reviews on things like Glassdoor, you don't get the full story if you're just reading the newspaper, because they're gonna create headlines that people want to read, right? And they're often negative as opposed to positive. But if you're able to get input from people who are actually working there, that's the gold standard of getting real information about what the company's doing. So I would encourage that as much as possible.
Hey, I want to, this is Gail. I just wanted to thank you guys for rounding this all up and having this talk. I have been impressed with the amount of flexibility that I've seen with employers these days, and their abilities to stay in contact with employees. I know I've seen just so many examples of creativity, like, you know, Zoom happy hours. I was shocked that a manager set up just to touch bases with people every 2 weeks. It just seems like people are going out of their way to make sure there's a place to just connect, not just work, but to connect and be human and share their frustrations or their joys. And so I think it's important, and I see companies doing that.
Yes,
yeah, it's a great comment, Gail. My hope is that people who are emerging, who are sort of early in their career leaders, are learning, are watching and observing and learning, because I think this is the way work needs to be. And as compared to even here locally in the Silicon Valley, 20 years ago when I started, or now 30 plus years ago when I started working, it's remarkably different. And it feels to me, and maybe you're saying this as well, is that this crisis has brought out the humanity in us and in companies, and largely as evidenced through leaders and managers. And my prayerful hope is that that will continue to deepen in terms of how companies are run, how they're managed, and how people are treated.
Yeah. Just wanted to make the comment that career development, thanks actually to Maggie and Karen, but we have a happy hour every week on Thursday, and it's a nice way to all meet together and sometimes speak about work, but speak about other things and making sure that like everyone is doing well.
Yeah, I want to add that my husband works for Dell, pretty big company, and his team has a check-in every week. You can come and you don't come. It's in the morning, and they walk during their check-in, or they're in the garden during their check-in. But it's a great way for them to connect and just say what's going on in their world. They get to meet the pets and see what's in the flower garden and see what's on the walk. And it's just a great way to be human. And they don't talk about work at all during that time.
Yeah, I love that. I've seen a lot of that going on too. And I think it's great. And like Paul said, I hope these types of things stick around, because I think what we're learning is we can work in a different way. We can still get things done, and we can also be good to one another and still get work done. So I agree. I hope these things stick.
So this is Jeanette. One of the things my team has been doing is we've been actually doing photo contests every single week and making it easy, making it fun, where what's it called, show us a ridiculous picture of your new coworkers, right? And so that way we learn about each other. But I agree with the whole check-in sessions with folks walking around, and we're also actually going to have a Cinco de Mayo luncheon next week. So just really kind of planning times for those kind of check-ins. And we've also actually started to have folks put on their calendars, this is nap time. This is when you can schedule meetings. This is the hour before nap time. This is when you do not schedule meetings. So it's really interesting about kind of how, I would say, how this experience has burst open the doors of authenticity, whether people were willing or not willing to kind of lay it out there. Something I'm interested in to see is kind of what comes from this for those organizations who choose to start transitioning to more remote work, right? Seeing that this proof of concept, given the unfortunate circumstances, kind of see it now and how that's going to then evolve kind of the work environment in general.
Thank you, Janet.
Just to follow up, Jeanette, on one thing that Tracy and I were talking about this sort of as it relates to MBA students potentially looking for work, but it also applies to anybody. And it occurred to me as you were talking about that I think a really interesting question that people need to be ready to answer, regardless of where they are in their careers, is what did you do during the coronavirus, the pandemic, right? What was it like for you? What was it like for you at work? What was different for you? What did you learn from that? And there is a lot of learning to be had if you focus on that and internalize it, meaning, how does this change the way you think about leadership or management, for example, if you want to be in that kind of a role? Internalize that and make that part of how you show up, not just now, but ongoing. Companies aren't going to codify what happened during this time and say, we're going to change the way we manage people. What happens is it changes because people change and because individual leaders change and decide to do it a different way, or continue to evolve toward that model or that standard. And more people want to work for those kinds of people. So I guess my challenge to all of you who are working is, and even those of you who are not, is how are you going to answer the question, what did you learn during the coronavirus epidemic? And what are you putting into practice as a result of that? Whether it has to do with leadership or not, could be anything, but I think it's an interesting and opportune time.
Any questions or comments or personal experience that you want to share?
Yeah, hi, this is Sarah Feinberg. Hi, everybody. Thanks for doing this. I am currently the marketing director for the Apothecarium, which is a series of dispensaries in San Francisco, as well as I have lots of ties from my prior positions into the food industry. So both of those industries being essential services. And my husband also is a chef, and so therefore he's out in the field as well as our staff and company. I'm working from home. However, we have our retail stores open and accepting visitors. So I kind of got onto the call a little bit late. I don't know if it was much of a discussion about retail in general or essential services, but just the comments I've heard about how people are keeping morale up with staff is one of the things that our leadership team is working on extensively, because we're experiencing, as anyone could note or imagine, a lot of fatigue in terms of our staff that's on the ground. It's really scary for them to be out there serving the public on a daily basis, and of course all the safety precautions they're having to take. Another trend, so therefore we are doing things like happy hours, or providing extra small financial bonuses, or other smaller bonuses or treats, if you will. Our teams are also on an A/B schedule so that there's no contamination between the teams as they go from work to home and back. But that's also starting to create a lot of work fatigue, especially as it is relating to people having that one day off, one day on. So we're exploring with business models constantly how we run. E-com was mentioned earlier. Certainly that has taken a front seat in terms of how we market to our customers, as well as, of course, delivery. Another trend, though, I know that is happening in cannabis as well as food is all of the fatigue, as I mentioned, but the labor pool. I'm not sure if it was mentioned earlier, but we're finding that as we're able to start opening positions again, as our business model sort of opens here and there with more deliveries or so on, some staff might not want to come back to work because they're receiving more pay in unemployment pay than they would have for their job. And this is particularly prevalent in the service industry like food. So lots of challenges, very, very different new world. It will be very interesting to see how retail in general plays out in the coming year, but we would anticipate that this is going to continue for many, many months in terms of the safety precautions, which of course, cuts right into our revenue when you can't have as many people in your store as you normally would like. So finding those alternative ways of marketing and selling will become part of our new business model as time goes on.
Maybe just before like Paul or Tracy comment on that, originally I'm from France, and in France we have unemployment laws where you can have up to 2 years of your like 95% of your salary. And in France, I used to hear like many times people saying, I prefer to stay unemployed, right, because I'm making more money. And now hearing that, I never heard that. I have been in the US like for like 32 years plus, and it's the first time I hear that actually.
Yeah, I've heard it from, of course, the food industry and other service industries. When we call to say, hey, we have a position available, some of them say, well, this makes more sense now, which I think is we're going to see a trend in rehiring. As other folks who lost their job and may not necessarily have had access to some of that unemployment might become more available for some of these other jobs. And then another major point, especially as it relates to the service industries, is that there are still also a huge swath of employees who are not eligible for unemployment or stimulus money. And that is a really big blow to our service industries. You know, seeing this firsthand, it's a really sad situation for so many of these families.
Hi, this is Marcia Tennyson, and I just wanted to mention I'm an independent consultant, but I work closely with a lot of state agencies in Sacramento and government, nonprofit sector. We do strategic planning consulting, leadership development, and at the moment we are, all of our calendars have been kind of attacked by coronavirus. So we're transitioning like everybody else to trying to help our clients in a new way. And so we're offering, you know, services to help management teams, you know, either provide coaching to the managers on how to, you know, work with their employees, kind of excellence at a distance type of thing, or working directly with teams to say, okay, let's set up weekly meetings so that you can talk about, number one, just the logistical things that still need to be in place for you to work effectively from home. Number two, talk about new business processes that have to now be in place to work in an online virtual type of setting. So that's been really interesting for us, and it's been fun. It's a different way of interacting. I'm used to being in large meetings with a lot of people. So now I see little tiny, you know, 2x2 squares of a lot of people. But it has been something fun and enjoyable. And I you know, as a self-employed consultant, I very much have been nervous about income stream and the future and all that. But I'm finding enjoyment and kind of, you know, getting to know my clients in a new way. And there's lots of resources online too. I mean, you literally just Google, you know, excellence at a distance, and there'll be tons of articles and things that you can tap into to help you. And then just ironically, I'm quite good at the Zoom happy hour, and I facilitate a happy hour with a couple of groups. One being a group of about 6 or 7 of us who are all alumni from the full-time program in 1993. And just as a you know, offshoot, I decided as the, you know, quote, chief facilitator of this group, I'm trying to keep things fun. So last night's happy hour agenda included a secret guest that I did not tell them about ahead of time. But I lined up Nicole Biggert. So Professor Biggert, who was, you know, our dean, of course, for I think 6 or 7 years. She's now retired, still teaching a little bit, but lined her up to come on 10 minutes after our start time, and she happy houred with us. And it was just fantastic to be able to reconnect with her and just kind of learn about what she's doing, hear about her perspective on the world now. And then, you know, she was delighted to hear from all of us in terms of where our careers and lives have taken us over the years as well. So I'm just trying to focus on kind of the fun and new things that are happening in this environment. And that's helping my anxiety stay at bay a little bit at least. But thank you for all the information. This has been great.
Any other comment? No, this is great. Thank you, Marcia, for like sharing that.
Yeah, I have a question. Can I go ahead?
Yes.
Yeah, so my question is, I currently have a temporary job, a temporary government job, and I was, from time to time, I do marketing projects, marketing and PR consultancy, and I had thought that this was the time for me to do this full time, to do marketing and PR consultancy and hopefully grow it into a firm full time, because I've gotten requests to do those projects without me looking for that work. And I don't know if, given the situation now, given the situation we're facing and the economic situation we'll be facing, I don't know if this is if this will make it more difficult, and if I should stay away from that plan and go back and look into when my project is over, go back into a full-time position, or if this presents an opportunity for me, because from time to time, I compete against large agencies. My overhead is very low. I can be very flexible when it comes to my rates. And so I don't know how to look at it given the situation we're facing. I would like to get your thoughts on from the panel. Thank you.
Tracy, do you want to?
Oh, I was going to actually say, if you wanted to jump in, I mean, I think, well, I'll touch briefly on it, but you might have more to say, or even some other people on the call, I think, might have some very good advice. I think, as we talked about earlier, it's sort of an opportunity now to be creative in the way you approach what you're doing, find niches in the market, because there are a lot of opportunities. They're just unexpected and different. So I think, depending on what your service is, and when you're talking to your clients, figuring out where their pain points are. So I think you could have a big opportunity here, but depending on what companies you're working with, who you're targeting as your market or your main clients, could impact your ability to do that. So I think if you're able to think outside the box and sort of look around, I know we saw some great things posted earlier about who's hiring, looking on Glassdoor and Indeed to see sort of what are the top markets right now, what's growing and what's changing, and focus your direction there. I mean, there's a lot of companies that are thriving right now. So I think it's just a matter of how do you position yourself. I
think there are some, I think it's an intriguing question, and I'm sure we've got some people who are still on our, what do we have people here? Still 44 people here, and somebody's got a pretty insightful way to say this, but I'll take a bit of a shot at it. And that is that there's a couple things working for you, or sort of in your favor. One is that this is a time when smaller providers of those kinds of services might very well be going out of business because they can't afford to continue, or they don't have the cash reserves to continue. For example, small agencies that have a certain number of people, right? They maybe have even 4 or 5, 6 people, but they can't pay them anymore. And so they just don't have a way to continue to deliver those kinds of services. So there may be some opportunities there. There are also opportunities, it would strike me, for companies, depending on the space that you're typically serving, the industry, for example, or industries. This is going to be a time where companies are pulling in external spending because their revenues are maybe going to be, certainly most of them are going to be maybe flatter or down. And so their profit margins are going to be squeezed, and they're going to be looking to pull in extraneous expenses, particularly with outside vendors. That's usually one of the first places that gets scrutinized, and the CFO sends down the dictate. So that being said, if you're more flexible on rates and you can provide a great service for the rate as a way to get into the client, for example, that gives you a foot forward, perhaps, in doing that. The downside is that you're going to need to have some financial runway to get this thing launched, because it might take you longer, depending on the level of business you've already been able to develop and the client relationship you develop that could be prospective projects for you in the near term. It could be a challenge to build enough business to make it worth your while. So, and I've been a sole practitioner before. The ongoing challenge, and I'm sure other people on the call would echo this, is the challenge is, if you haven't done it before, is that you are spending as much time as you can finding new business and as much time as you can servicing existing business. Yeah. And that latter piece is the piece that you got into the job to do and got into the career to do, because that's the fun part and the exciting part and the thing that you're adding value to. But finding business is just as important. Otherwise, you don't feed yourself. So that tug of war between those two pieces of the job can be a real challenge, and you just have to be ready for that.
And maybe just to add one piece, usually when you have a situation like the one we're having, where people get laid off, then you have more people also becoming their sole practitioner and trying to do consulting projects also.
Gail has a question, and then we have one in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't have a question. I just wanted to add on to Paul's piece. As an independent contractor, I think it's a both and. I think you can continue to build your business, but keep your foot in wherever there's money. So, for me as an executive leadership coach, I have my own practice, but I also, a lot of I do a lot of coaching on a contract basis for larger organizations like UC Davis, right? So I have a stream of income and I have my own practice too. And that really came in handy during this epidemic because I have a couple of small contracts with large companies and I have my own business. And as the speaking dried up, because you couldn't go anywhere and speak anymore, then I could fall back on these other streams. So I think if you're going to be go out in your own, hang your own shingle out, it's just good to diversify your income stream, especially initially when you're taking off. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Maggie, you said there was like a question?
Yes, Jeanette asked, the nonprofit landscape and revenue is also drastically impacted. What is the appetite at your different companies to continue philanthropic contributions?
So I can just speak for Intel. I mean, Intel has always really been very philanthropic, and it's something I really love about working for Intel. They normally do matching donations and they sort of set aside X amount of dollars. They just increase that, I can't remember the amount, but by a significant amount so that anyone who wants to donate to help with the current effort and make a donation to an organization helping with the coronavirus, they're matching all of that money and they've increased the amount of money that they're spending. They've also been doing a tremendous amount of work to donate supplies, to change some of their manufacturing to actually create masks and do things for the communities where they are to help with healthcare. So I think I'm actually really proud to be working for Intel now because they've done a tremendous amount right now to give back and they're spending a lot of money to do it. So it's been nice to see.
Thank you.
I had a question on, some of us, like for example, myself is an individual contributor, right? But I'm one of those fortunate enough to also have a job during these times. So how do we individual contributors who are in many cases not hiring managers help fellow GSM folks who might be in need?
Well, I know there is the Rainy Day Student Fund, and we just had Picnic Day and Give Day, and so that was an opportunity. I mean, I'm sure that the school is always still taking donations, and I mean, I personally love to donate money to the Student Rainy Day Fund to help people who need it. I think also making yourself available to for networking opportunities to help people if they reach out to you, even maybe posting out on LinkedIn or getting a note out to the alumni network that, hey, I'm available to help make connections with you, to talk through your situation, and just making yourself available for people, I think is a great way that you can give back right now.
And I admit we're gonna have a separate conversation, but there are like many ways, again, like as I said at the beginning, you can help also like through career development, reach out to the community and help the community, both on the student side and, alumni. So we'd love to continue. And, our team is always happy to welcome, help and participation.
Hi, this is Nikesh Pahuja. I work. Thank you for doing this. I work with Chevron in analytics, machine learning, NLP. Really interesting study I read yesterday about, so Paul talked about how the world will look like maybe going forward. And I read really interesting study about whether the governments and the organizations, are they collaborative or they are kind of isolating in this environment, and in responding to this pandemic will kind of define next 3 to 5 years what impact it will have on technology, on society, on environment. For example, if governments or organizations are really collaborative, then we'll see those kind of values in society going forward. And they'll care more about environment, and there'll be more technological collaboration. So those kind of different scenarios, and it was really interesting to read through different scenarios. Not all of them might play out in 3 to 5 years. And second, for anybody whose job is at risk or who's looking for a job, So even my job could be at risk because of the reorg going on in Chevron. I would say, people here have longer careers than me, but then even during the 14 years career that I have, anytime I had to move on, I wanted to stick to the previous job because I was comfortable. I knew people, had a good circle, but I had to move on because of any issues. Say there was not funding or reorgs or other things. The period between when I was trying to find a job was painful. Sometime when it was extended, it was hard, but then there was always light on the other side. And in fact, in many cases, my next job was more, it was better, it was more suited and pushed me in the right direction. So I'm an optimist, and I will just give this advice to anybody who is going through this time or whose job is at risk. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul or Tracy, any comments on?
No, I think it's been a great conversation, though. I love enjoying hearing from others on the line.
Yeah, I think one of the values of this community is the chance for you guys and for all of us to continue to connect, share ideas, share opportunities at times, and share support. And I'm encouraged by that. There's a lot of really smart people, as you'd expect, on this call. And more importantly, the aggregation of all of your experiences is far more than somebody like Tracy or I can bring, just two of us. So the more you guys can share, the more you're going to learn from each other. So I'd encourage that to the extent you can continue to do that.